Hello and welcome to the NARR and ASTHO sponsored webinar, Radiological Emergency Preparedness and Hostile Action-Based Exercises, Federal, State, and Local Perspectives. Thank you for participating. We will have time for questions following each presentation and then again at the end of the webinar. We will begin with an overview of the Radiological Emergency Preparedness Program from Mr. Albert Coons. Mr. Al Coons is the Exercise and Planning Section Chief at FEMA in the Radiological Emergency Preparedness Branch. He also acts as the Deputy Branch Chief of the same branch. Mr. Coons is currently responsible for ensuring the THD REPP Exercise Program Evaluation Program. Mr. Coons started his career in the radiological field in the U.S. Navy Nuclear Power Program. He also has over 20 years' experience in commercial nuclear power plants as a plant operator, senior shift supervisor, and nuclear engineer. Mr. Coons has over 10 years' experience at FEMA as an emergency preparedness specialist, and his experience includes work in the areas of emergency planning, situational analysis, and as a responder. He has had 6 years of experience in the REPP program at FEMA. Following Mr. Coons' presentation, Ms. Patty Gardner will provide an overview of the Hostile Action-Based Exercise requirement. Ms. Gardner is the Exercise Operations Section Chief at FEMA's Technological Hazards Division, Radiological Emergency Preparedness Program in Arlington, Virginia. She is currently responsible for maintaining a robust exercise program to improve the readiness capability of the federal, state, tribal, and local governments faced with probable radiological emergency accidents surrounding nuclear power plants. Following her presentation, Mr. Ken Yale will provide a state perspective on the Hostile Action-Based Exercise requirement. Mr. Yale is the Chief of the Radiological Protection Section within the Office of Waste Management and Radiological Protection of the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. He has been involved in the state radiation control program since 1995 and has spent the first 9 years conducting X-ray machine inspections, including inspections. In 2004, he took a position with the Radiological Emergency Preparedness Unit within the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. In 2011, he was promoted to Chief of the Radiological Protection Section, and in this position, he oversees the Radiological Emergency Preparedness, Radioactive Materials, Radon, and Environmental Monitoring programs. Finally, we will have a presentation from Sergeant Ronald Bush on the local perspective of the Hostile Action-Based Exercise requirement. Mr. Bush is currently the Assistant Coordinator for the Emergency Management Division in the Berrien County Sheriff's Department. He has been involved in nuclear power plant response activity since 1998. Beginning in 2005, his areas of responsibility have included the development of emergency operations plans and procedures and guidelines for the protection of the public and the training of responders and volunteers in emergency preparedness. Sergeant Bush has a background as a volunteer firefighter and is trained as a hazardous materials specialist and certified bomb technician. I will now turn the program over to Mr. Al Coons for his presentation.
Thank you, Meredith. We'll get started here. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on what coast you're on. First slide is going to give you a look at what we're going to discuss during my presentation. We're going to look at the origins of the REPP program, commercial nuclear power plants in the country, our mission, the basis, statutory basis, what reasonable assurance is, the emergency planning zones, the National Preparedness System alignment, our rewrite of new Reg 0654, which is a joint FEMA NRC document, our planned revisions to our regulations 44 CFR 350 through 354. We're going to look at the REPP exercise program and some additional ongoing initiatives. The REPP program came out of the accident at TMI. The Commission recommended implementing federal off-site radiological emergency planning and preparedness. President Carter transferred oversight of this planning and preparedness from the NRC to FEMA. NRC remains responsible for the on-site activities, emergency preparedness activities. Commercial nuclear power plants. This is a slide showing where they're located. As you can see, most of them are located on the East Coast, where the larger centers of population are. There's 64 nuclear power sites, over 460 jurisdictions around those sites, including the states. Population within 10 miles is roughly 4 million. Within 50 miles is roughly 120 million. The REPP mission, enhance the planning and preparedness and response for all types of radiological emergencies. When I first joined the REPP program, we were getting into the improvised nuclear device and radiological dispersal device planning. And in fact, we had people on the planning for the White House Science Committee. We ensure adequate off-site emergency preparedness, protect the health and safety of the public. We inform and educate the public about radiological emergency preparedness. Statutory basis is public law. 96-295 is the NRC Authorization Act of 1980, which established emergency preparedness and planning for nuclear plant licensing. Requirements include developments of response and preparedness plans, must show adequacy of both on-site and off-site emergency planning preparedness. NRC consults with FEMA for licensing determinations, and we develop a reasonable assurance criterion for determining off-site preparedness. This reasonable assurance, FEMA has primary responsibility for reviewing and evaluating radiological emergency planning. We do this by site assist visits, evaluating exercises, annual reviews of plans, assisting the state and locals any way we can. And the process of determining this adequacy is referred to as reasonable assurance. Emergency planning zones. There's a first of all, there's a 10-mile radius emergency planning zone, and you can read. I'm not going to read the whole definition. You can read it off the slides. And a 50-mile one. The 10 miles is the plume exposure pathway, and the 50 miles is the ingestion exposure pathway. There is a typo on this slide. State and locals must participate jointly with the licensee and appropriate local government in an exercise at least every 8 years now. That changed a couple of years ago. Okay, this is the start of one of our initiatives. We're aligning to the National Preparedness System. We're reviewing new Reg 0654, our regulations, and the REPP exercise program. We're encouraging all hazard plans versus separate REPP plans. Right now, approximately 2/3 of our state and local governments have all hazard plans, which includes REPP plan as an addendum to the state all hazards plans. And we're continuing alignment with updated preparedness guidelines, directives, and policies as they come out. Currently, we're rewriting new Reg 0654, which as I said earlier, is a joint NRC FEMA document. We just finished the federal staff review, and we're adjudicating the federal comments. Our next stakeholder engagement will be in June of this year, which will be the introduction comments and limited Section 2 comments, which are the evaluation criteria. Expected public comment period to be fall of 2014. This will probably be published in 2016 is what we're expecting right now. The final product. We just recently had FEMA leadership designate our regulations as a priority for calendar year 2014. So we're going to be updating our Reg 44 CFR 350 to 354. Those will be aligned with the national planning system, and we're going to appropriately align our financial processes and clean up our old language. Planning for this review and revision will be developed this year in the summer. REPP exercise programs. Last fall, we embarked on a mission excuse me, to update our REPP exercise program. We've met twice now with state, local, federal, utility partners to gather their input. And we're making progress in updating it. Ongoing initiatives still going on. Rewrite a nuclear radiological incident annex, the National Response Recovery Frameworks, that's ongoing. The Federal Radiological Preparedness Coordinating Committee is in charge of that right now. We're going to have a full federal exercise in 2015. It's now named Southern Exposure as of today. And we're developing decommissioning guidance right now with the NRC. Most of you may be aware that in the next couple of years we will probably have 4 sites undergoing the decommissioning process. Are there any questions?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you on the phone, you may register a question by pressing the 1 followed by the 4 on your keypad. You will hear a 3-tone prompt to acknowledge your request. If your question has been answered and you would like to withdraw your registration, please press the 1 followed by the 3. For those of you on the web, you may use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen to register a question. One moment, please, for the first question. And we have no phone questions at this time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd like to introduce Patty Gardner as the next speaker.
Thanks, Al. Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to take just a few minutes of your time and go into a little bit more detail on these hostile action-based exercises. That is one scenario out of many, but this one is a requirement for the licensees to actually do at their sites every 8 years. And so in an effort to work together with the licensee, the FEMA, state and local, emergency preparedness agencies have been working closely together with them. So we're going to be, tying on and doing these hostile action-based exercises. Little bit of much smaller list than Al's slideshow. I only have about 5 things to discuss with you. I'm going to keep it really short. So out of 62 plants that we exercise at, we have 29 that are completed. We have 19 that are completed right now, and they're on your screen. I think, the ones in May, we might have, one more this month to finish off, but after that, I think we're making really good headway through each of these sites. Now, every site here every nuclear power plant has to have a hostile action-based exercise done before December 31st, 2015. So you'll see these are going to be picking up most of the exercises over the next year and a half are hostile action-based in nature. So there's very limited ones that are just our standard radiological release or ingestion pathway, which Al mentioned earlier, which is the one that's out to 50 miles. An example of that is actually the full-scale exercise next year, which will not be a hostile action-based exercise. It will be a full ingestion pathway out to 50 miles event. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about those types of exercises. So what we've been seeing, oops, wrong way, this way? Did I go too far? Hang on a second, there we go. So what we've been seeing across the nation really in these exercises is some real strengths of doing this this type of scenario. The mobilization of response personnel has been great. Backfilling those positions that might be being utilized somewhere else was one of the big areas that we were concerned with. Communication between incident command posts and our off-site response organizations To give you a little definition of off-site response organizations, that's basically any type of responder that is outside of the fence of the nuclear power plant. So we exercise all of them, and we identify their plans and go through all that stuff. Implementation of the implementing NIMS and the ICS by the incident commanders for a REPP event has been very successful. And demonstrating the direction and control by the incident commanders and making sure that people that need to get on the plants, on the site, they're able to get there, and to get off the site are able to get off the site as well. So, and finally, demonstrating the knowledge and ability to analyze and use competing finite resources by incident commanders. That ties back into that first mobilization of response personnel, in that we have our radiological, our plume exposure pathways, so our normal 10-mile exercises, where we have plenty police and fire and emergency and EMS personnel. Whereas if it's a hostile action-based exercise or scenario hostile action at the plant, those resources could be seriously depleted by them having to respond on site, or by the event being so large in nature on site that we have to keep people away from the plant. So the competing finite resources, we did a gap analysis with all of our state and local agencies, and were able to make sure that they were able to backfill all of those positions that might be used during a hostile action-based event. So they were able to do that with their mutual aid and things like that. So those are our demonstrated strengths. Some areas for opportunities. I like that this slide is smaller than the last one. Just 3 areas: implementation of emergency worker exposure control training. That is really important when we are utilizing mutual aid. There are people that will be coming in, responders that will be coming into an area inside the 10-mile emergency planning zone that aren't normally part of our training program in our state and local areas. So we've implemented a lot of just-in-time training, and we are trying to expand a lot of the training out past the 10 miles to ensure that everybody has the exposure control training that they need. The other one is the coordination of protective action decisions. We call them PADs, in order to keep the incident command post and the EOC apprised of actions already taken. This is really speaking to the fact that we have an incident command post now, whereas we're typically in the REPP program for the last many years, we've only been dealing with an EOC, an Emergency Operations Center. Well, now some of the jobs and some of the roles that were being played out in the Emergency Operations Center are already done at the Incident Command Post. So when they transition, when they close the Incident Command Post and transition over to the Emergency Operations Center, we're able to not have to do any additional work that might have already been done at the Incident Command Post. That piece right there is really important to take back, and share with their state and local agencies, and make sure that they are able to make that consideration. And the last one is communicating with the utility. So it's basically, again, all of our resources off-site, coordinating with everyone on-site. And, it's been recommended that we all use the same language, we all talk NIMS, so we all should, be able to talk better with each other. So this is an area of improvement that we're still working on, and I haven't heard any real, pressing issues from it, but it's just important to know that if they have a certain number of fire department responders coming in, or SWAT teams, or EMS, however they're going to get on site, they need to have that communication piece in place to get on site when there's a hostile action, on the utility. And this is different from how they would normally get on, because all the security on site is going to be so locked down that they're going to be questioning and double checking anybody that's going to be coming across or coming through their fence. So that's another opportunity we have for improvement. Specifically speaking with exercise and evaluation, we have had some challenges in evaluating these exercises, and that's most of it's because of the scale and the scope of the incident command post and the scope of what they're trying to do at that incident command post. So any of you are familiar with incident command posts with a law enforcement background, we know that an ICP could be a cop car at a corner with their sergeants in the car, and he's coordinating everything. That could be an incident command post all the way up to a full-scale mobile truck or van trailer of some sort. So we need to, depending on the demographic of the area and, where we are in the country, an incident command post could be completely different. So it's a little difficult to evaluate them to a certain standard. But we've been able to do that so far. Coordinating the controller injects, again, between the EOC and the incident command post, just to make sure that everything's being met on an evaluation side has been a little challenging. It was really important for us to make sure that we definitely had an evaluator at the incident command post and at the EOC, and that those two people actually met up very shortly after the transition happened back to an EOC to make sure that we are meeting all of the requirements and all of the objectives of the exercise. The next one falls along the same lines of the second one, allowing time in the scenario and extent of play for the incident commander to demonstrate the implementation procedures before the EOC assumes command. So you're seeing a trend here. It's really how we're working from the incident command post to the EOC, and that the dynamic between the two when we need to transfer, our command, transfer any type of roles and responsibilities over to the EOC once it gets stood up. And finally, evaluating communications and actions taken within the incident command post is very challenging due to the use of lots of headsets. If any of you have been inside the incident command posts that are trailers, it's very confined space. So if you start to add evaluators into that room, it gets really loud. We do try and be like a fly on the wall and not say or do much of anything. But not only that, but these communicators, these responders are using headsets. So we as the evaluators or even the controllers are unable to hear any of the communications that are going back and forth. So it's taken an effort on our part to just pay really close attention to what's happening at the incident command post and watch the web EOC if it's being used or any of those things to ensure that the pieces that we need to see are actually happening. And so those have been our challenges along the way. Moving forward, as things progress through completing more and more hostile action-based exercises, we have found that the FEMA response, or the FEMA, my staff essentially going out and supporting the staff and the state and local agencies has been needed less and less. And that's really encouraging for us because that means that we're getting everyone up to speed and they're starting to really understand what's going on. But in continued support of that, we have lots of planning workshops and meetings, activities, evaluations, all of these things still going on. And if you know of anyone that needs the support, that's exactly what my shop is here to do, is to make sure that everybody gets any questions answered that they might have. So the next thing that we're doing, the biggest piece that's up for us, is getting our off-site organizations to submit best practices and lessons learned. And what I'm doing now is I'm really trying to push forward either through an HSIN channel or an ELIS channel to find a way to collect these best practices without compromising anyone's plans or security or that nature. So I'm trying to work through that because I really feel like we got to do this again in another 8 years. And I would hate for anyone to have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, with turnover and things like that, we want to have a good repository for a lot of information. So I hope to have all of that completed. So we're going to have all these done at 2015. I hope to have the lessons learned and best practices out to everyone by 2016. And that is all for me. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them from you now. Otherwise, I think we're going to move on. But do you have any questions?
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, to register a question over the phone, it is the 1 followed by the 4 on your keypad. Once again, that is the 1 followed by the 4. One moment, please, for the first question. And we have no phone questions at this time.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. We'll move on to a presentation from Mr. Ken Yale.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is a subject I could talk about for hours, but I've been asked to keep it to 20 minutes. So what I'd like to do is briefly discuss from the state perspective how a hostile action-based incident or exercise differs from the scenarios that have been used for years, and some of the lessons that we learned from our experience with the D.C. Cook exercise, which was held on June 4th, 2013, and the Fermi 2 exercise, which was just recently held on April 29th, 2014. Now, while security at the nation's nuclear power plants has always been tight, it was recognized that the off-site response organizations, or OROs, had not always integrated well with site security. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, with their partner, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, put in requirements for the utilities and the OROs to conduct evaluated hostile action-based exercises. As you can imagine, the scenario involving individuals actively trying to damage a nuclear power plant is very different from a system malfunction that eventually leads to problems with the reactor. I'll briefly touch upon 3 areas where the HAB incidents are very different: the planning, response, and exercise evaluation. We'll look at each of these, and I'll share with you some of the challenges we faced as we prepared for the D.C. Cook and the Fermi HAB exercises, and then I'll share some of the lessons that we learned. Before I get too far along, let me provide a little background. Michigan is not a home rule state, so much of the emergency planning and public protective action decisions are done at the state level. The state is also responsible for providing field monitoring teams and dose assessment. Most of the state's radiological emergency response resources are located in Lansing, which is roughly 2 to 2.5 hour drive from each of the plants, and they're not kept in an on-call status. In other words, it would take probably 3 to 6 hours from the initial notification until all of the state's radiological emergency resources would be available in the area. With a HAB incident, a large-scale response may need to be mobilized quickly and before the state assets are available. The utility and surrounding community would have to deal with a HAB incident on their own initially, and for that reason, the impacted county had to take an active and lead role in the planning process. D.C. Cook is located in Berrien County, which is in the southwest portion of Michigan. For D.C. Cook, the entire 10-mile EPZ, or emergency planning zone, falls within Berrien County. In contrast, the Fermi is on the east side, and it's located in Monroe County, which is in the southeast part of Michigan, and the 10-mile EPZ impacts both Monroe and Wayne counties. Sorry, I had a little mix-up here. There we go. When it comes to planning, you need to start early, meet often, and be flexible. By starting early, it's important to start at least 2.5 years before an exercise. One of the biggest challenges is to identify all the key players. As new players are added or identified, they need to be worked into the planning process. Some of the information may also be safeguards, and a process for dealing with this type of information needs to be developed. Another great reason to start early, the planning will likely identify equipment gaps. In these days of tight budgets and purchase requests can be delayed. With new equipment comes new procedures and a requirement for more training. In a, quote, standard exercise, the plant personnel handle everything in the owner-controlled area, and the off-site responders deal with the issues outside the owner-controlled area. With a HAB exercise or incident, you have to plan for sending off-site responders into the owner-controlled area to support the response effort. This raises issues of worker dose limits, turnback limits, security, etc. An example of how the state helps in the planning process is that at the state level, we supported the counties by helping them to select appropriate dosimetry that would help them both off-site and on-site response, as well as establish the protocols that would be used with the new dosimetry. Meeting often. Once most of the key players are identified, a planning team should be formed, and it is critical for the planning team to meet regularly. Berrien County had great success by splitting the meeting into two parts. The first is for the general response considerations, who will be doing what and when, and the second half of the meeting was much smaller and consisted of the group which would discuss the sensitive information. By meeting regularly, the, quote, jurisdictional issues or turf wars can be worked through. In many cases, who has responsibility for a particular action is not always clear. For the plan to be effective, it should be clearly identify the responsible parties whenever possible. Therefore, it's important for the planning committee to work through these various scenarios and reach agreement on the roles of the various agencies. As a side benefit, this process has fostered better working relationships between many of the response organizations. The state can help facilitate these meetings and identify state assets that are in the region that would likely be part of any response. Being flexible. A HAV incident could begin with a host of different initiating conditions. It could be a hijacked aircraft, an act of sabotage, an attack by a hostile force, a combination of all the above, or something completely different. There are only so many ways the plant can break that will lead to fuel damage and a large-scale release of radioactive materials. These are pretty well known, and planning for them is pretty straightforward. But with a HAV incident, the initiating condition and how the event will progress are both unknown, and there are almost limitless possibilities. The planning team needs to write a plan that can be specific yet adaptable to the situation. Like the planning, the response to a HAV incident is very different. The incident may occur with very little or no notice, escalate quickly, and require the off-site response organizations to respond in the utility zone or controlled area. The response will have to deal with rapid escalation, be scalable, and remain flexible. For a HAV incident, the most advanced notice that will likely be received is if there is some intelligence that an attack may take place. While some preparations could be initiated, a full-scale response would not likely occur based on intelligence alone. This response will likely be initiated when something happens at the plant. In a, quote, standard scenario, systems at the plant begin to fail and there is a progression through the 4 emergency classification levels: unusual event, alert, site area emergency, and general emergency. And for those who participate in a number of these drills, there's always the unofficial 5th level, which is called lunch. The progression from one classification to the next occurs fairly systematically. It may take hours to move from one classification to the next, and pre-planned actions are initiated at each emergency classification level. For example, at the alert classification, the State Emergency Operations Center will be activated, field monitoring teams placed on standby, and communications with the plant and federal agencies established. When the conditions are met for a site area emergency, the field monitoring teams are deployed, the state may request federal resources, and protective measures may be taken, especially for special needs populations. And then at a general emergency, the state will issue public protective action orders. Additional federal resources are requested, and state dose assessors are busy making public dose projections. In a HAV scenario, the emergency classification will change as quickly as events at the plant develop. For example, a hostile force moves from the owner-controlled area into the protected area and into certain key locations at the plant. The emergency classification level will change with each of these events. So if it takes 15 minutes to go from breaching the site boundary to a critical area, the emergency classification level would go from an alert to a general emergency in 15 minutes. Or the plant may not have time to communicate the lower classifications, so the first notification is the general emergency. This puts the state response behind from the beginning. It can also mean that the state is not ready to issue protective action orders as quickly as they are needed, and therefore the county must be prepared to take actions without state support. The state also needs to have plans in place to prioritize actions, since many of the actions taken at lower classification levels will not have been completed by the time the higher classifications are reached. The response has to be scalable. There's no need for 10 local law enforcement agencies, 8 fire departments, 2 SWAT teams, and the bomb squad to respond to a lone shooter. But you may need all of these assets and more if there's a large-scale attack. Identifying what resources are available and how quickly they can respond during the planning phase will allow that response to scale to the need. As the State Emergency Operations Center becomes operational and engaged in the response, the state needs to anticipate the needs at the incident command post and begin arranging for assets to move into the area. Since each event will be different and bring different challenges, it is virtually impossible to pre-plan all possible scenarios. Therefore, a broad understanding of what assets are available and their typical response time is important. The response must also be flexible. Like scalable, the situation on the ground will determine what type of response is needed. However, the situation on the ground will be changing throughout the incident. For example, the hijacked airplane scenario is very dependent on where the aircraft comes down. If it impacts on the nuclear power plant, the off-site response organizations are responding to a HAB incident. If it overshoots the nuclear power plant and hits a street, it's a large fire and possibly mass casualty incident. Regardless of the impact point, the potential for the fire to spread into vital areas may be very real. The evaluation of a HAB exercise also presents new challenges. There are 2 types of HAB exercises, partial and full scale. From the Michigan perspective, the main difference between them is if the state field monitoring teams are evaluated. The D.C. Cook HAB exercise was a partial exercise with the field team center and field teams simulated from a control cell. The Fermi HAB exercise was full-scale exercise which included the evaluation of the field monitoring teams and field team center operations. With all exercises, we have to meet the evaluation criteria. The criteria remain virtually the same regardless of if it is a HAB exercise or not. However, a HAB exercise offers the opportunities to mix things up a little bit. This presents new challenges in meeting all of the, quote, standard criteria. The FEMA REPP program manual addresses many of these issues, but questions remain. For example, how do you get credit for dose assessment if there is no release? Or how do you demonstrate field monitoring teams when there is no plume to monitor? These issues and a host of others are dependent on the scenario chosen and must be worked out with the FEMA region ahead of time. Both of our exercises, we had to have a second scenario ready that was injected into play at the end of the original scenario in order to meet all of these required criteria. The HAB exercise also introduces new facilities. The incident command post and associated staging area, for example. The addition of these 2 entities raises a number of questions that must be addressed. How will they be demonstrated and evaluated? Is one representative from a particular agency adequate? The ICP will be manned by a combination of utility and off-site response personnel. Since the NRC will be evaluating the utility response and FEMA, the off-site response organized response, how is a mixed strike team evaluated? And how do the incident command post and field team center work together? This is a learning process for everyone involved. The utilities, the ORs, the NRC, and FEMA are all on the learning curve. As new information becomes available, changes will have to be made. Cooperation and understanding between the players and evaluators will be key. So having good controllers that can quickly recognize if the situation is going sideways and make adjustments will be critical to success. So now I'd like to touch on just a few of the lessons that we learned with our 2 HAB exercise. I'll just be able to hit a few of the ones that I think are most important. First off, communication flow. During a HAB incident, there are several new communication paths that must be considered. One of the lessons we learned during planning is that the communication flow between the utility and the off-site response organizations needs to work both ways. Typically, the utility notifies the off-site response organization of a problem at the plant. With intelligence information, however, it may be the off-site response organizations who have the information that needs to be passed to the utility. This may seem trivial, but we discovered a number of issues. Who should be notified? Is it site security, the control room, both? How and when should they be notified? What information do they need? Another communication flow issue involves the coordination between the incident command post and the field team center. Once the State Field Team Center is operational, they want to deploy field monitoring teams near the plant. During a, quote, standard incident, there is no problem with doing so. However, during a HAB incident, it may not be safe for the field monitoring teams to work near the plant, or they may need an escort to ensure safe passage. This requires good communications between the Incident Command Post and the Field Team Center. It also requires the Incident Command Post to understand what the field monitoring teams are there to do. If the Incident Command Post doesn't, they will request the field monitoring teams to report to staging where they likely will be forgotten. We also learned to think outside the box. It became very clear that things change with a HAB incident very quickly, but it's important to have someone who maintains a big picture view of all the activities. We thought outside of the box and created a new position called the Health Physics Advisor. The Health Physics Advisor only needs a computer with internet access and a phone. As soon as they are notified, this individual logs on to MySIMS or WebEOC, which is the internet-based incident management software, and they establish a bridge line. Eventually, the Health Physics Advisor is joined on the bridge line by the technical representatives at the State Emergency Operations Center, Field Team Center, and Joint Information Center, allowing for instant communications between all of these facilities. Another example of outside-the-box thinking is to realize that even if the field teams have not arrived on scene, radiological readings can be obtained by asking for the dose, if any, received by the first responders who are wearing dosimetry and already reporting readings to the Incident Command Post. There are countless other examples. The main thing is to remember is a HAB incident will not progress in an orderly fashion, so quick thinking and creative solutions can go a long way. Staying focused. With a HAB incident, there are many things happening all at once. It is very easy to focus in on just one aspect, say dealing with a hostile force, and completely lose sight of the fact that it is also a nuclear power plant incident. Having one or more people tasked with keeping the focus helps the team from straying too far. It's also important for people to stay in their lane and on task. This requires good coordination and communication. It won't work to have the State Emergency Operations Center trying to control the activities of the Incident Command Post. The State Emergency Operations Center can assist by providing resources and pre-staging them in the event they are needed. I can illustrate this with an example from the Fermi exercise. There was a fire on the roof of the reactor building as part of this scenario. The Incident Command Post requested a ladder truck. At the State Emergency Operations Center, however, they were making arrangements with the National Guard to bring in a helicopter with wildfire fighting capabilities, in other words, with a bucket truck to dump so they could get water perhaps quicker to the reactor building. So there was two solutions to the same problem, each being coordinated independently, but working together as a team. So the HAB incidents present many challenges and opportunity to improve response capabilities. With proper planning and coordination, the exercises can be a great learning experience. We've learned a lot from these exercises and look forward to doing more of them. At this time, I can take any questions.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, to register a question, it is the 1 followed by the 4 on your keypad. Again, that is the 1 followed by the 4. One moment, please, for the first question. And as a reminder, please pick up your handset before entering your request. And we have no questions at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Great, and Sergeant Bush, you're up.
Carl, I'm keeping everyone else from doing something different this afternoon, so I won't take too long with this. Thank you for the chance to come in and speak on the local perspective on such an issue for there. As Ken explained, where Berrien County is at, we also have planning and response requirements for 2 nuclear power plants. D.C. Cook, which is wholly in Berrien County and has 2 reactors, and Palisades, which is in Van Buren County, just north of Berrien County. So we get to exercise every single year, so it makes it a little more of a challenge for us. But I think it helps us do a much better job. The 6 topics I have today, you see on the screen, and I've got a few points locally as far as how we had to go through and change our procedures to meet the new HAB requirements that came out in the REPP manual. The first was a big one, which is Emergency Operations Plan. So we have a section developed which is just for radiological response. And as Ken mentioned, we are not a home rule state. That means that we have a public act which clearly identifies the process for declaring emergencies locally and requesting state and federal assistance. But because of the hostile action exercise, in our exercise we went from an unusual event to a general emergency in less than 30 minutes. So imagine that first call for help coming. Once the first responders started arriving on scene, you almost already had a general emergency. So it was clear we couldn't wait for the traditional emergency classification level to increase our staffing levels in our EOC or send that declaration for that first call for help from assistance from the state. So we had to update our county emergency operations plan to reflect the options of both the calling in staff and the declaration changes to again meet those REPP requirements for the FEMA evaluation of our local plan. But that caused the locals, us, to do traditional state actions because they weren't in place yet. So imagine that first call for help and we're getting the first responders going on site. We're having to make decisions that traditionally for the plume exercise the state would be making for us. So it's kind of out of our comfort zone, but working with the state experts, we were able to go through and formulate plans to go through and do that. I think we're pretty effectively. So it worked out pretty well. With the emergency declaration, we had in our request everything, and I got a nice little picture of the kitchen sink. And that's basically the best way of looking at it. So we talked and identified our gaps, what we need and what help we need from the state. So we normally put our declaration up to the state at the site area emergency classification level. That's normally when we would run out of resources locally. But because the events happened so quickly, we couldn't wait for that level to appear. So even though we have our own tactical teams, our own bomb teams, we were still asking for the state to supply whatever assistance they can as quick as they can because it is happening so fast. And that went into the flow of information. Again, traditionally, the plant would declare whatever classification level they have locally. And then at that point, the communications would go up to the state and the state would get information down to us locally. Well, this kind of put things 180 degrees, where the plant was talking directly to our dispatch center, talking to our first responders, and we were then getting information up to the state. And they were basically chomping at the bits to get whatever tidbits of information we had because that would affect their part of the response. So we developed a process and procedures to get information from the command post or initial incident commander to our county EOC and up to the state EOC, all while maintaining the REPP standards of having the messages numbered and tracked between the command post and the EOC. And these were important messages that included such as what missions were developed between the command post in coordination with the plant, when those missions were assigned, when they were completed, the situation status as far as what was going on to, again, go up to the state, any special equipment requests that we had. All of this was tracked and then forwarded up to the state EOC so they had an idea what was going on locally because, again, they weren't being talked with by the plant. It was all coming to us. So it's kind of a change. The next important part was the protection of the public. And we look at it at the county level as far as a planning issue, an ARCA, or a deficiency. And locally, we look at if we can't protect the public, that's not a good day for us locally. We start talking deficiencies. So we spend a lot of time on how to do this correctly because, again, the state was not there to give us the guidance. So we developed a process for having a precautionary relocation of the public. And we followed the state's procedure during a hostile action scenario of doing a precautionary evacuation within that 2-mile circle. So we had a process to do that from the command post so the initial incident commander could order that precautionary relocation and then forward that information up to the state. Even though there was not a general emergency declaration, there was no protective action recommendation from the plant, we knew that because of the speed of the incident, we wouldn't have time to follow that traditional step and process to get it done. The next part was road closures. We have a 6-lane interstate highway within 1 mile of the reactors. So we had to have a process in place to request the closure of a state trunk line. And that was an interesting conversation in itself and took probably 6 months to get clarified because that is a federally funded highway and the state doesn't like to close those down. But we realized that because of the potential adverse effects to the public, safety of the public, and so forth, we had to go through and have that roadway closed down, but doing it in such a way that we removed the traffic off of that state trunk line that didn't affect the evacuation routes of our folks inside the 10-mile circle. So that took some planning to get that addressed and identified. The second part is countywide school lockdowns. Is that we've all discussed and heard about locking down schools for active shooters and things like that. Now we're locking down a school because of an attack at a nuclear power plant. And we did that because of concerns about secondary attacks and also the protection of the students in case there was a release or it did get out of hand. But in the past, we would do that locally at the site area emergency. We started moving students or special populations out of that 10-mile circle area. Well, we're doing it earlier because, again, we couldn't wait until it got to that classification level to go through and do that because it is such a process to get those students moved safely. Next is public information. In the past, the county and state would come to a joint information center with the facility, and it would then be a news media center. Because of the hostile action exercise, is that the county went there right away once the first call for help came, because we had to go through and provide information to the public on what was going on at the site, and we sent law enforcement personnel to be the spokespersons so they could go through and actually ensure that information was not being released that was inappropriate, that could compromise the response or the investigation. Again, looking at those REPP standards to make sure we're doing it correctly so we're not giving out information we shouldn't be giving out to the public. Besides protection of the public, protection of the responders is next on our priority list. And this caused us many conversations over several years, and Ken already mentioned the issue of identifying the proper PPE to go through and do that with. So at the county level, we purchased electronic dosimeters in place of our current direct reading dosimeters because the DRDs weren't practical for a tactical kind of response. You had to look into a light, you had the hair that could be bumped off a scale and so forth. So imagine a tactical team going in, actively engaging adversaries on scene. They can't really stop and look at a light to get their reading for every 30 minutes for a dosimeter. Also the potential for higher exposure levels, which we couldn't read on our traditional 0 to 2.0 rem DRDs, where the electronic dosimeters could go up to 50 rem, which allowed for that higher potential dose exposure on site. With that in mind, we had to go through and have another way of actually reading those dosimeters because we couldn't go with the traditional audio alarm because, again, imagine the tactical response going on site. The alarm could give away a tactical person's location so the bad guys could know where they're at. So we had to set up with the vibration alarm only, and then every so often when able to, get the reading back to the incident command post. Exposure limits. This was a new one for us at the local level. I'm sure all you folks understand the TEDdy concept. That is something different for us at the local level because normally we are not going on site, getting into that kind of a plume, having to worry about that kind of exposure. But since we're now going on site, we had to develop a process or procedure to identify that total effective dose equivalent standard. So if we're looking at a dosimeter and it reads 2.0, it actually means 10. And that was a bit of a challenge to get our tactical folks to understand the difference and why that's so important. But with that in mind, we developed a new turnback card in cooperation with Ken from the DEQ to have that in place of our traditional DRD turnback or exposure dose limit cards that follows EPA 400. So this one here is a different color, it's in a different bag, a different kit to show it's a different card for the folks that are either going on site or in the command post in that 2-mile circle because they could be exposed to a higher dose. With that thought in mind, we had to then develop a process of a volunteer responder form, which everyone who would be coming to that 2-mile circle responding to the plant would sign a volunteer exposure form acknowledging they would exceed 25 rem, again following the EPA 400 guidelines for that. And if they didn't do that, we just had another job for them to do outside the 10-mile circle. But that way we were able to go through and have that identified that they could exceed that 25 rem. And why is that so important? Imagine a tactical operator or a firefighter on plant property and all of a sudden they reach their 25 rem exposure dose for life-saving. They just can't stop their activity and leave the scene because they've reached that 25 rem dose level. So by acknowledging then they volunteered to exceed that, they could then finish their task. Part of that on the back part of the card was also the potential health effects of the exceeding that dose. So we kind of covered all those requirements by having this new form that was developed. The potassium iodide. Again, normally the state, through Department of Community Health, would direct the ingestion of potassium iodide tablets for first responders. Because, again, the state was not in place to do that, we developed a procedure locally, either through the Incident Command Post or in conjunction with our EOC and public health folks locally, to direct the ingestion of KI by first responders. So again, we still met all the same requirements, but had to change a lot of procedures, because in the past, the state would be giving us that directive, and if they're not fully activated yet, we've got to then meet those same requirements locally to protect the public and to protect the responders. Next came identifying all the resources, and this probably took us 3 to 4 years of advanced planning because it was so involved. But out of it, we developed a standalone hostile action-based plan that is an attachment to our county EOP. And since then, we've turned it into a template which has been sent probably in several states across the nation, been used several times to develop locally owned plans. But what this did is that we worked with the plant and local responders to identify, under a worst case scenario, which is what they call a B5B scenario, law enforcement, fire department, EMS, public works resources that could be needed for that worst case scenario. That was put on a first call for help list. So once the plant called and said they were under attack, our initial incident commander could then request those resources activated and would go directly to staging. So that way the initial incident commander had that first list of resources to call upon to start responding right away. So it saved quite a bit of time. But doing that required a process to track all those resources, not just in the command post, but also in the Emergency Operations Center, because again, following the NIM standard and the REPP requirements, we use the available, assigned, and out-of-service basis for tracking resources both in the EOC and in the command post. We did that locally in the command post by kind of modifying the FEMA ICS 209 form, which is like a T card which is used to track a resource from staging to on scene to maybe like in a base or camp situation. But we modified it to show that the resource was meeting the REPP requirements. So they've got their just-in-time REPP training, they've received dosimetry, the KI, the safety briefing, they've done all the requirements, so they are now a usable resource on site, still matching those REPP standards and requirements. And another part, because of the rest of the story, we have all these resources now going to the plant. We had used them in the past for setting up access control points or public reception emergency worker decon centers. Well, now they're going to the plant. So we identified other resources, including volunteers, to staff those decon centers because our responders were not going to the plant. So we identified those gaps. It also helped us work out our declaration to the state on what resources we need to have them send to us, whether within state or since we border Indiana, using an EMAC request to get resources from, say, South Bend, right across the border from us in Indiana. As we go along the response, we're now worrying about decontamination of plant personnel, because in the past, normally the plant protection folks decon their own personnel. Well, with the plant potentially damaged or those folks unavailable, how would you then decon plant responders? There's a process in place for offsite to go to an emergency worker decon center. Well, we changed our plans and procedures that would allow plant personnel to use an offsite decon facility if theirs was unavailable. So we had to have a process in place that the plant had to approve that would allow their responders to come to an offsite location to be deconned and checked. So it was very important for that. With a response to the plant, there's specialized equipment, either tactical or fire resources. And I'm not sure how it is in your communities. We have very few of those resources to waste by not being able to take and get them back from being contaminated. So developing a process, whether it was vehicles or tactical equipment, weapons, vests, things like that, that they would stay in a warm zone and another operator could use that equipment, because if it came out and we couldn't decon it, it was basically put in the waste until decon later. We would take those resources and lose them very quickly. So having a process to do that, leaving them in the warm zone and just transition from responder to responder worked out very well. One example is that if the responders went into the site, we would use a school bus to transport them to a worker decon center. And then that school bus would always stay in the warm zone and never go through that decon process. So we kept that same school bus for transporting workers from the site to the decon center. and then using a clean bus to transport the responders back to a staging area. And that seemed to work out pretty well because we didn't have the chance of losing one of those valuable resources. And the last slide is probably one of the most aggravating at the local level, is how off-site now goes on-site. It was mentioned earlier in the presentations about having different standards for off-site responders versus on-site responders. So that first call for help comes. In the past, we would get it locally through the operations section in the control room of a change of a classification, normally from normal status to an unusual event. Now we're getting a call from the central alarm station or secondary alarm station, CAS or SAS, that they're under attack. Still no classification level change. So we're starting to do things prior to any classification level that would direct our actions. So that change in the notification process, we developed a direct phone line between our dispatch center, CAS and SAS, and the control rooms. So that way, what that meant, we no longer had to have a callback verification procedure, because normally if the plant called, they would hang up, we would call back a set number to verify the plant was indeed calling for assistance. By having a direct phone line, that meant not having to disconnect, so we did not lose time because it was happening so fast. But we also learned that plant security has a different technology and terminology for what they call things. So if they were to call an operator, that meant something different to a 911 dispatcher. So we had to have training going back and forth on some kind of plain language situation. We also developed a hostile action-based notification form similar to a plant status form that kind of prompted certain information from the plant as far as location of the adversaries, number of adversaries, type of weapons, explosives, all the things that a responder would want to know. It kind of got them to get that information for us. The next step came when the operations did break in and say there was now a change in the classification level. How is that process done? Because again, we still couldn't violate that REPP standard of getting that classification level change announced quick enough to the local, so that was very important. Next was the buffer zone. So once that first call for help came from the plant, we followed our buffer zone protection plan to cordon off the plant roughly a mile outside of the reactors in the OCA, owner-controlled area. But developing a process to communicate between the initial incident commander and the plant security and dispatch to make sure information was still flowing back and forth to allow certain responders in based on credentialing and verification of their information. Next was ICP facilities, and again, meeting the REPP requirements. Our responders know how to respond to different types of incidents, but now doing it meeting the REPP standards, that was quite a challenge. Something as simple as getting the first call for help and setting up that buffer zone. How do we then get those initial responders to symmetry and potassium iodide tablets? So developing a process to replace those first responders from the buffer zone with responders who have gone through the process of getting the dosimetry and KI. We've already talked about the use of electronic dosimeters and the authorization to exceed turnback values. Again, why is that so important? Because we can't expect the responders to leave once they're engaged in something. So having a process in place to get those responders changed out as quickly as possible without violating the EPA 400 dose limits was very important. Towards the end, the embed of plant personnel. This actually worked out very well. We developed a process to embed off-duty plant security folks with our tactical teams coming on site. And it proved to be very beneficial because we're on site on our nuclear power plant on a monthly basis, so we can become very familiar with how to maneuver around the facility. But if you're calling in mutual aid forces who have not had that ability, how do you embed a plant security person who can then guide them around the plant where they've got to know with access? That proved to be very important. That then came down to FEMA versus NRC exposure limits. Once you start embedding plant personnel with off-site responders, we have a process in place on exposure dose limits and when we ingest KI that is different for plant personnel. So understanding their dose limits and how their plant emergency director would have to go through and waive their exposure limit and also order the ingestion of potassium iodide tablets for their responders and how that works with off-site is something to be worked out. So we identified a process in place to do that, to make sure that if they were embedded in our team, we would do whatever that person did first. So if we had to go through and don respirators because of the exposure limits, then their plant personnel that was with us also donned a respirator. If we ingested KI, they would ingest KI. If their turnback limit was reached and they had to leave, we all left as a group. So identifying that process and putting it in place was very important. And the last part is badging. I think we're one of the few, if not the only, law enforcement agency that is badged, meeting the same NANTEL and plant procedures for unescorted access into the plant. So that gets us into a plant very quickly. We meet the same requirements. We know how the plant is designed. We know how to get from point A to point B. We are still meeting the same fit for duty requirements as a radiologic responder on site, but it's been a great benefit to us locally on knowing how the plant works and how to get around it for this kind of a response. And with that, that is the extent of my presentation. Thanks for the opportunity to present, and I'll take any questions you may have.
Thank you. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, to register a question over the phone, it is the 1 followed by the 4 on your keypad. Our first question does come from the line of Ray Fishencord. Please proceed.
Yes, we've been told by the FBI that they're going to go right to the gun battle, and the utility needs to be prepared to push dosimetry forward to them because they're not going to give up any territory. Has anybody solved that?
This is Ron from Berrien County. We worked on that in cooperation with the FBI. They would be involved in our incident command post, and we had a process in place to get them dosimetry. So that way when they came to our incident command post and staging area, we could still track them. We could still make sure that they had the right radio frequencies and so forth. It was just an agreement we worked out between the plant, off-site, and the FBI. I think once it's explained to them, it took probably a year or 2 years to get that agreement worked out and how it was understood. But it takes a lot of communications and explaining that the plant probably won't get them dosimetry, because if you're attacked, they probably are going to cover, so they may not have anyone who can bring them that dosimetry. So we worked it out where they would just come to our command post, we would get it to them there, and then they would work in with the operations part of it to then do their functions as far as investigation for it. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, once again, ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, that is the 1 followed by the 4 to register your question.
Hi, I see that we do have a couple questions from the chat function. Ron, do you identify any distinction between shelter in place versus secure in place?
For Berrien County, we don't. It's the same term for us. Whether it's going to be the protection of the public for a shelter in place or a school, they're still trying to find a location inside the facility where they would be protected from an external hazard. Now, we do have another type of lockdown in Michigan, which is called an outside threat lockdown, which is probably more of the secure in place, where it's an immediate threat around a building. But for us, we used a shelter in place to at least make sure we could secure the facility and control ingress and egress from the facility to then move the students or the population to a more secure area. So it's the same term for us.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the phone?
And we do have one more registration by phone. Our question comes from Pat Dosty. Please proceed.
Yes, this question is for either Sergeant Bush or Ken Yale. In Maine, one of the things that we have is a civil support team, roughly about 20 to 22 National Guard people that have all the facilities that you would probably consider specialized resources. And I was just wondering if you had something like that where they have decon capabilities and actually surveying potential and everything else as an added adjunct to your normal teams that you would have.
Yes, in Michigan we have the 51st Civil Support Team, and they're luckily close to 2 of our nuclear power plants. And that was one thing that we requested in our local declaration to the state, is to activation of the Michigan National Guard and the 51st Civil Support Team, just to bring down their additional resources for not only monitoring decon, but also to help with other factors that they could provide. So we have the same resource, yes.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you.
This is Ken Yale, too, and I would go ahead and add that we have, over the course of the last couple of years, actually tried to, during non-HAB exercises, integrate the 51st civil support team with our field monitoring teams at the field team center. We've tried it both ways, having them integrated so we have a mixed team with some state personnel, some National Guard personnel, and we've also done it with having them run their own teams independently. And we've had good success both ways. They certainly are eager and willing to help and support in whatever fashion they can.
Thanks, Scott.
And we have no further phone questions at this time.
Great. Well, I would want to send a thank you to all of our presenters, as well as a thank you to everyone who participated today. We will have a recording of the webinar on the NARR Clearinghouse site, which is radiationready.org. And please follow up with us through the website if you have any further questions. Thank you so much.